In this first module, we're going to take a look at the sociological perspective and talk a little bit about what sociology is and what sociology is not. So first of all, sociology is the scientific study of human society and social interaction. We're not necessarily interested in animal behavior or looking at individuals, we're more so looking at how folks interact with each other in society. The primary focus is really around groups and the patterns of social behavior. Less concerned about the brain and maybe an individual motivation like psychology would be concerned about, but here we're really looking for those patterns of social behavior. And our goal is to understand the forces that operate throughout society. Again, looking for those patterns and social groups. There's a theory in your book that talks about the sociological imagination, and this comes up from C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills really thinks about how your individual personal troubles or individual experiences, those things you come across in society, fit into a much larger web of kind of public issues or forces in the larger society. So for example, if you think about maybe you had a situation in your family where someone was either laid off from their job or out of work, that would be your example of a personal trouble or an individual experience. But then you start to think about, well, I wonder if there's a larger problem of unemployment going on in society, or that there could be something else going on in a larger social force. Being able to understand how your individual experiences fit into a larger social web is what we refer to as the sociological imagination. It's this understanding that things you observe day to day fit into larger patterns of social behavior. So it might be that you go out and you stand in an elevator and you notice that you always face the front of the elevator or the doors. Where did this come from? How did you learn this? Well, when you are able to reflect and understand that there's kind of an agreed upon social interaction that goes on in an elevator, that's taking your individual experience and applying it to a larger social web. That's the idea of the sociological imagination. And over time, through taking sociology courses, the goal is that you'll actually be able to take your experiences that you're seeing day in and day out in society and make more sense of it from a sociological and larger social web of kind of social experience. So again, as you go through this class, hopefully you'll start to understand a bit more of how each thing that you're seeing in society fits into a larger web. Then we get into these paradigms, or what the book will call the sociological perspectives. These are really ways that different sociology camps think about approaching studying society. As you can imagine, sociology is definitely focused on the broader social web, but well, what does that mean? How does each individual sociologist go about studying that? There are three major focus points in the text and three major perspectives that we'll use in this course. I warn you now, these are definitely theoretical and they certainly have a lot of content in the text that's a little hard to digest. The first is structural functionalism, or often just called functionalism, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The next is conflict theory, and the last is symbolic interactionism, or interactionist perspective. So let's dive into structural functionalism. If you think about functionalism with this mentality that everything serves a purpose, if something ceases to serve a purpose, it's going to cease to exist. So sociologists in this particular belief structure really see it as a very high level, very interwoven, harmonious theory, meaning that they believe that everything is going to serve a purpose, and if it didn't, it would simply go away in society. Think of it like a human, or this diagram here of kind of the android figure. And imagine each component. The head was education, the arms were maybe family, religion, the economy, government. It all works together. And that if you were to remove any one part of that, society might feel really lopsided or start to fall apart. For example, if we had no government structure, it would be really hard to have a functioning society. So functionalists try and look for, well, why do things exist and what are those purposes that they serve at a macro level? And often when you think about purpose, there's a few different things you can think about. Robert Merton in your book talks about both the manifest and the latent functions. And manifest simply means, well, what was intended? What was recognized? And latent being a bit unintended. If you think about going to school, a functionalist would say, look, going to school, the manifest functions are to learn maybe math, reading, writing, but then there's other unintended consequences like socialization. You learn how to share, you learn how to raise your hand to ask a question. We don't send you to school explicitly for those things, but they come with time because you're there. So know that there's a lot of things that may serve a very intended purpose, and there's other things that may serve a very unintended or less obvious purpose. In conflict theory, They see everything as constantly changing as a response to social inequality and are really interested in the power relationship. How do those with benefits maintain their positions of power, and how are those who are not in positions of power potentially facing inequality or a disadvantage? Karl Marx was certainly the most famous associated with conflict theory. He actually worked in partnership with another gentleman named Engels, and Marx and Engels essentially wrote a number of pieces specifically looking at this power relationship, that who owns the means of production often dictates who can name and come up with what society is focused on. So that's one way to look at it. Very different than a functionalist who sees that conflict as healthy and necessary. Conflict theorists always see it as changing and leading towards something different. Then you kind of go to symbolic interactionism, and this is very different on a spectrum. While functionalism and conflict theory were very much about society at a macro level, symbolic interactionism is focused on individual meaning that people place on their interactions socially. It looks at things like their ability to understand the way you're dressed that day, the way you present yourself that day, symbols, and trying to make sense out of your social world and interpreting that social world all fall within social interactionism. They see it as kind of performing a part, so that when you're interacting with others, the persona you put forth in an interactionist perspective is really about, well, what does that mean? So if I went to the doctor, and the doctor is dressed appropriately in what you would perceive as doctor's clothing, they've got degrees up on the wall, you would assume they are the doctor. You probably didn't ask to verify their identification against those degrees. You didn't ask to see a specific reference necessarily before visiting them. But yet, that's all because you perceive that that person standing before you looks the part of the doctor. If they didn't look that part, let's say they just weren't dressed right, or maybe their vocabulary just felt different, you might start to question if they were really the doctor. So symbolic interactionism takes into account the sense that we have a shared meaning of accepting a lot of things based solely on the outward appearance, and if people play the role and look the role. So it's kind of an interesting perspective for sure. So let's try and apply all these, right? So these are very theoretical. Not one is better or different than the other. It simply is just different ways of looking at the world. And so how would each of the perspectives apply to maybe poverty? Well, let's talk about functionalism. They're going to see that poverty creates jobs for social workers. It creates a workforce that takes the dirty jobs, meaning those jobs that other people don't want. Maybe it's, picking up trash and collecting, those things, working in kitchen positions, a lot of housekeeping roles, those types of things that people don't want to do. And it creates an established level within society for structure and balance. They see everything as, look, poverty would serve a purpose. It keeps a clear delineation of what the roles are. And frankly, it will create jobs for social workers. Conflict theory would be on the opposite side. They'd say it's really a power imbalance. Those in poverty are being exploited by those with power, and that imbalance of rewards and power is going to lead to social change, and that change is through conflict. Finally, you've got symbolic interactionism looking at it very differently. They would look at how we label or judge the poor. What's it feel like to be in poverty? What are the meanings attached to that? And what do the symbols of poverty stand for? So again, all three of the perspectives will come up throughout the class. It's not to say that any one, again, is better or worse. It's simply just different ways of looking at it. And most sociologists will fall somewhere between all three of them. For myself, I certainly believe that there's some element of functionalism that's valid in some cases, some element of symbolic interactionism great in others, and sometimes conflict theory. So each perspective lends itself to sociology and will certainly be part of what we look at the rest of the course. I just want to recap with the sociological imagination also being that way in which you take your personal experiences to look at the world. These are really complicated things, and I want to thank you for diving in and getting your feet wet with the sociological perspective. Certainly review everything in your text, as there's always more content, and this is just to provide a very basic overview. Thank you.